25 Voter Pod with our top 25 voters, John Warner, Chad Conine. Welcome back, guys.
Howdy.
Guys.
Yeah, someday maybe we'll do this in person, but we'll all have to get a shot first.
Well, as we mentioned pre-Zoom here, we all cleaned up for this.
That's true. We are clean shaven.
Yes.
Well, and I would like to point out that we're not exactly Corona bros among the sports staff. It's just that we don't have a space that we can consistently occupy together.
Well,
there's no reason for us to all drive up to the sports office because it works better on Zoom.
Yeah.
And there are going to be a lot of things post or as things go back to some semblance of normal that are like best practices that we learned. And I think Zooming is going to continue to be a major player in life.
I agree. And I also fear that to a certain extent because I fear that, it's going to lead to more remote coverage and that kind of thing. But that's a whole nother discussion. Let's talk some college basketball. So Baylor went on the road Tuesday night, beat the Longhorns 83-69, a very impressive win. It was close for a while. And the Bears are now number one in the net rankings, right? Kind of a computer rankings. Also
the RPI.
Yeah. And then the KenPom rankings too, which is a poll that rankings that a lot of people look at. So with that win, and then assuming the Bears go and win this weekend, which we don't ever assume anything, but they're certainly, they should win. How much ground do you think that Baylor makes up in the poll this week, considering it was 61-3 Gonzaga in first place votes last time out?
Well, I would think they'd get a few more first place votes. Of course, I said that last week too, and it didn't happen. But you just can't overlook the strength of their schedule right now. And Gonzaga got all their good wins early. They're playing in the West Coast Conference. They're 8-0. They're winning by 25 points, but they're not playing anybody close to being in the top 25. And Baylor's playing a lot of top 25 teams. And they've looked impressive doing it. So I'm going to vote them number one again, and we'll see if anybody else does.
Chad?
Well, when you look at the fact that Gonzaga has 61 first place votes and it's week 11 in the poll, so the people that have been voting them number one have been voting them for probably 8, 10, maybe even 11 weeks all season, and they're not going to change their mind unless Baylor beats Gonzaga. So
no, I think that's a fair point, because I think a lot of times, when I was voting in the women's poll, if a team kept winning, I would keep them where they were at, or sometimes ascend them, but you don't necessarily drop ones that haven't lost, and Gonzaga is obviously in that boat. Now, I do think Baylor's case becomes stronger by the day. I also think that the national attention that Baylor's starting to get, I think it's starting to pick up more and more. So it's kind of off the rails a little bit, but I saw a tweet the other day, and I think it was, I'm not going to call out the person's name, but it was a former Baylor football player. And he was talking about how, he was watching SportsCenter the day after the Texas win, and they showed one highlight, and it was the Greg Jones dunk, and how could you, disrespect the Bears like that, and yada, yada, yada. And I was thinking, my gosh, first of all, this is the epitome of the butthurt Baylor fan. Can we say that here on the podcast? I don't know. Is anybody even listening? I got to ask Wynn and find out how many viewers we've got. But anyway, so I was thinking to myself, if you had watched SportsCenter the night before, which I did, they had Seth Greenberg on there, and they talked about Baylor for a long time and had highlights of the game and praised Baylor up and down, to the point where Seth Greenberg said if Baylor and Gonzaga played today, he's taking the Bears. He thinks it would be a great game and he wants to see that game. But I don't think Baylor's getting disrespected. Okay. I mean, even 61-3. I mean, Gonzaga is pretty friggin' good. Okay. So I think that let's let it play out, and what a game it'll be if they finally get to play.
Well, on this point, I saw a certain media member who we know, a national media member who's been around these parts a few times. I won't bring up their name just because for various reasons. But this person tweeted that Baylor Gonzaga is the national championship game that sports fans deserve. And I just wanted to reply to this person. I refrained from replying, but I just wanted to say, hey, friend, this isn't college football. We don't just vote on who we want to see. We have this thing called the NCAA tournament. And if those two teams were the last one standing, then great. It'll be a great game. If they're not, then that's not what was meant to be, and that's not the best game. So
I understand that sentiment.
ESPN is just a hype machine anymore. It's not what it was back in the 90s when you watched a 30-minute Sports Center and all you saw was highlights of games.
Well, I think that the deserve sentiment is the fact that both those teams were pretty freaking good last year, and we didn't get, they didn't get to finish their seasons along with everyone else, but they both had legit national championship hopes last year. And so this idea is, and then they didn't get to play in the regular season. So I understand maybe deserve is not the right word, but it's the one I think college basketball fans want to see. I think, generally speaking.
I don't want to see it.
Yeah, but you're a Tech fan. You don't care. I'm saying you take Joe Blow, a fan who just follows college basketball and not maybe a specific team that hates Baylor.
Hey, if there's a fan that doesn't have a dog in the race, I don't care what he thinks.
Chime in, Johnny. Save us.
Well, kind of more to your original point that a lot of voters probably won't vote Baylor number one until Gonzaga loses. CBS's national writer, Gary Parrish, said the same thing. He's done it for 15 years this way. Unless that number one team loses, he's not going to replace it with somebody else. And I can respect that. But at the same time, you've got to look at who Baylor is playing right now and who Gonzaga is playing. And Baylor's, their case just keeps getting stronger. And to me, Gonzaga it's either just stays the same or it drops.
Yeah.
So, I would think more voters would give Baylor consideration this week, but I don't think there's any way they pass them unless Gonzaga loses.
Yeah, agreed. All right, well, let's move on to another team in the Big 12, Oklahoma, which made, I think I read where it was the biggest jump by a ranked team from week to week. So they were 24 in last week's poll, and they jumped to number 9 in this week's poll. And that came off the heels of top 10 wins over then number 9 Kansas, number 5 Texas, and number 9 Alabama. So some impressive wins by the Sooners. Now, if we go back, I think the Longhorns were a little depleted. But
yeah.
So the question is this: was such a big jump warranted? Because then their first game after being ranked in the top 10, they go out to Lubbock and it's a close game, 57-52, but Tech wins that one. So and that's a number 13 ranked Texas Tech team, so obviously no slouch. Sooners are now 11-5 overall, 6-4 in the Big 12. Should they have gone into the top 10?
Well, I voted them 14 for this last Monday's poll. And I thought, man, I jumped them 10 spots. That's really a lot. You hardly ever see that at mid-season. And then when the poll came out, My gosh, they jumped 15 spots. Yeah, that is very remarkable. The only time you really see something even close to that usually is early in the season, where there might be somebody who's unranked or, 24, 25, beats a couple really good teams. But, the polls are more volatile early than they are later in the season because more teams have established themselves. But yeah, I was stunned. I thought it was too much. And, but then they lose to Texas Tech. So they're probably going to drop a little. It might be 14 this week.
Chad?
Well, I think it was absolutely ridiculous. And I saw somebody predict that they would jump into the top 10. And it's just absurd because, I mean, they beat some good teams, but Kansas is slipping. Kansas probably shouldn't even be ranked at this point. Texas was, down, depleted, and that Big 12 SEC challenge, I'd like to see the numbers, but I would say the home team in the Big 12 SEC challenge has won somewhere around 80% of the time since that thing has been going on, and so, I mean, I don't know who's vaulting them. So, cause there had to be people that had them not ranked, that had them as high as like 5 or 6 for them, because most people you would think would, say, okay, they deserve to move up some, but 15 spots, it's just crazy. And honestly, I thought Texas Tech controlled the game against them the other night. And also they don't vote on things like these. But the fact that Austin Reeves was out meant that they weren't going to be playing like a top 10 team for very long, or maybe they've got some good young players that are coming on strong. Moja Gibson from University being one of them. But yeah, it's ridiculous that they jump that much.
Agreed. I think y'all make some good points. I understand voters, if they're just looking at, okay, they beat 3 top 10 teams, but Chad just amplified why in some of the cases. I mean, Texas was down some guys. Kansas really, shouldn't have been a top 10 team. And the Alabama win is a good win. I mean, let's give the Sooners some credit. But and obviously they're a solid team. But I watched parts of that Tech Oklahoma game the other night. I was flipping back and forth between them and the Rockets, but watched a lot of it after the Rockets game ended. And I agree with Chad that Tech had that game in hand throughout, even when it was close. It didn't really ever feel like Oklahoma was, going to take over the lead. And, just watching OU, I didn't see a top 10 team there. I mean, I saw a good team, but I didn't see a top 10 team where you just went, wow, they're really tough.
Well, I tell you, I watched a lot of Oklahoma State TCU last night, and here's the difference between Oklahoma, which is a team that deserves to be ranked, and those two teams, the Horned Frogs and the Cowboys, that played last night. Oklahoma plays smart basketball. They take care of the ball on the offensive end for the most part, and they're playing really hard on defense. And so they're a team that has it together. And I think in college basketball, having it together, knowing what you're about, knowing your identity and playing to that is a big part of it. And I think Oklahoma does that better than like the two teams I watched last night. And that's probably why they're the top half of the Big 12 team.
Well, here's another theory. Brady Manick looks a little bit like Larry Bird. Maybe some of the voters thought Bird was playing.
There probably are a few old codgers on those voters that probably were covering teams when Bird was playing. So,
right.
We're not going to throw you into that mix, John.
I wouldn't argue.
So let's move on to the women. The North Carolina State Wolfpack, who Chad has mentioned before that he's had as high as number one. Have you still been voting him number one?
I voted him number one from the time they beat South Carolina in December until last week, when I obviously had to move him down because they lost the game.
Well, you're looking pretty smart right now because the Wolfpack went out, knocked off number one ranked Louisville the other night. So should NC State, in the mind of the rest of the voters, obviously Chad's already got them there, jump past?
Well, I don't. I moved them down after they lost to Virginia Tech. And here's the thing, their center Kanane was out in that game, and that had an impact on that game, I'm sure. But it's hard to vote on who's out for COVID and who's not out for COVID, as I mentioned Austin Reeves a minute ago. But I had a little bit of a Dennis Green moment on Monday night. NC State was who I thought they were.
Nice. Well played. So South Carolina is 2 and UConn is 3. Does NC State jump those teams?
No, I think South Carolina is the deserved number 1 team in the country. They're number 1 when things came to a halt last year, and their only loss is to NC State. I think those 2 teams in Louisville are kind of right at the top of women's basketball this season. And it's interesting because 2 of those 3, South Carolina and NC State, were at the Greensboro Regional in 2019 when the Lady Bears were there and actually played both of them. And, it's been interesting for me to watch. I think her name is Ashley Kanane, the center for NC State. And she was kind of a raw looking player a couple of years ago when they played Baylor. And since then, wait a minute, they didn't play Baylor. But they played one of the Iowa or South Carolina in the first game. But I saw them play, and she looked kind of raw in that game. But now that she's a junior, man, she does everything on the floor, and she does it well. And I'm starting to wonder if she might be the best player in women's college basketball, a little bit under the radar right now. So, it was interesting to watch that game and see the way NC State really took over in the fourth quarter. Now, Kim has been saying that there's no dominant team in women's basketball. And I think she's right, because I watched that game and I go, okay, how does Baylor stack up? And I mean, you guys have probably done this a lot. Watch a game and try to figure out where a team that you're covering or interested in, how they fit in against that team. But I think Baylor for sure could hang with and in some ways dominate parts of the game against either one of those teams that I watched the other night. Louisville, for the number 1 team, Louisville didn't have a whole lot of places where they just took a firm handle on the game and said, we're going to control this part.
Yeah, you mentioned the parity thing, and it's funny. One of the complaints you sometimes hear about women's college basketball is just the fact that it tends to be top heavy. UConn is UConn every year. Well, now UConn looks a little vulnerable. I mean, they're still ranked 3rd in the country, but and so, I guess my question there is, does that mean it's more interesting now? I mean, because if there isn't that one dominant team, does it open it up for anybody to win?
I think so. I think any sport, and by the way, it's Elisa Kanane. I just looked it up while you were asking that question, but I want to make sure I got that right. Elisa Kanane for NC State. But when you have an Oregon like last year, or Baylor, in 2019, and really in 2019, Baylor wasn't the perennial power or the favorite that everybody was looking at. It was more like Oregon, UConn. And Baylor beat both of those teams. And I think in that sense, in the UConn sense and the Oregon of last year's sense, I think that the Lady Bears kind of get overlooked sometimes in being that presence. But I think any sport benefits. I mean, when Duke is undefeated, when I don't know if Gonzaga, Baylor are those teams in men's basketball this year. So I think any sport benefits from that kind of team that's like, how in the world is anybody going to beat them?
That's a good point. And Duke was that team a couple years ago with Zion Williamson. It was like, oh my gosh, these guys look unbeatable. And then,
except for Coach K forgot how to coach defense.
Well, and then they were beatable, and Zion blew a shoe, and whatever. So, all right. So obviously, you guys hit on it a little bit, but this is a strange season. It's not a normal season. In a normal season, 20 wins usually is kind of the benchmark for making, the NCAA tournament. If you have 20, you should get in. it seems like the bubble teams always have around 18, 19, which is why they're on the bubble. So this year with a reduced schedule, what's the number that should, be the rubber stamp?
I'm going to say 16, 17, maybe even as low as 15 in some cases. Yeah, 20 is a pretty high number this year. My hope though is just because of everything that's happened with COVID, they won't put in one of the blue bloods who have had a really bad year, somebody like Duke or Kentucky or Michigan State, who don't deserve to go. But I just hope they don't give them more consideration just because of the circumstances.
Chad?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Kim Mulkey has said multiple times, that they lost 5 games and their preseason WNIT games. And I think across the board, teams lost 4 or 5 games. And for a team that's vying for an NCAA tournament bid and trying to get to 20 wins, usually those are, at least 2 or 3 real winnable games. You might have a good non-conference matchup in there that could go either way. But so, if you're, if you got 16 wins, it's going to be real tough for somebody that has 16 wins and didn't go to the tournament this year, I think that's probably, I think 17 is the safe spot.
Mm.
What do you think though, Bryce? I mean, you don't have like as much of a dog in the fight.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah. So I do think that the committee, the selection committee, does a pretty good job of selecting worthy teams. Now, do teams ever get in based on, who they are or historically are, because they're one of the college basketball blue bloods? Sure, that happens. But I think maybe more so this year than in past years, you're going to really have to break down and dig into these teams' resumes, because they might have played a different number of games and they had games canceled that they would have helped their net ranking or the former RPI or whatever. So that committee has a challenging task, but I think they really have to dig into the value of each team beyond a number like 17 wins. Okay. Who are those wins against? Did they have some games canceled that, would have helped them? I mean, I think you have to take into all that stuff into account.
Yeah. What if we mentioned the Texas OU game. Texas was down to 8 scholarship players. And by the end of the game, they were down to 5 after guys fouled out and Shaka Smart wasn't there. Are you going to take games in consideration like that? That's one they probably would have won with those guys. Is that a consideration? Games like that where you're missing guys because of COVID?
Chad, what were you going to say?
Well, I forgot, but I'll address I'll address John's point. Is I don't think that you can put it under that much of a microscope, because you either win or you lose a game. You can't say, well, I honestly feel like if they'd had Jericho Sims against Oklahoma, they would have won that game, and Courtney Ramey. But you can't say, well, we're gonna boost them up and give them an extra win because they lost that game when they had guys out with COVID. Luckily for Texas, I think they're going to get to that win total, and I think they've also got that blue blood name. So those are both things in their favor now. But consider somebody like TCU and think about, how much are you going to value Power 5 conferences in a conference like the Big 12 that has, anywhere from, or has had about 5 ranked teams in the conference all year. And now, TCU with the win over Oklahoma State last night is sitting there with 10 wins with a month left in the season. And if Oklahoma State doesn't get some sort of waiver on their postseason ban for this year, and is TCU this seventh team in from the Big 12 because of that?
Good question. I think you both make fair points. I do think it helps to look at, who's in, who's out in terms of, injuries, COVID, that kind of thing, and take those things into account. That said, Chad, I think you make a fair point about, a win's a win. And like, I go back to, taking it to college football. There was a lot of sort of anti-Notre Dame sentiment at the end of the year that they got into the Final Four. And one of the things was, they beat Clemson, but it was Trevor Lawrence was out. Well, that's not on Notre Dame. It's not their fault that Trevor Lawrence was out. And the fact was they were an undefeated regular season team that lost one game to Clemson in the ACC title game. To me, they belonged in. I mean, by resume. Now, so if you're looking at these teams' resumes, I think you also have to look at, like, watch the games and watch these teams and see Duke isn't very good. They don't belong in the tournament, Now maybe they catch fire this last month, but you know what I'm saying? Watch the teams, see who's good, put those 68 teams in.
Well, all the things we're mentioning and the amount of scrutiny that we're suggesting, it kind of makes you just want to, just chunk it all and go the other way and go, okay, we're going to go BPI. Pretty much we're going to go straight BPI, which is the old RPI or whatever it is. And
I'm sitting there thinking blood pressure index or something.
Well, no, but the net rankings and the BPI, I mean, I feel like they're a fair measure of strength of schedule versus, how you performed on the court, because you can't put everybody under the microscope and say, how has COVID affected them and what do they look like on the court and who have they played and who have they not played. But to some extent, the computer rankings kind of take those things into account. So I think it might be a year where they lean more heavily on those type of rankings than even before. And they were used heavily before.
I think this little debate that we're having probably sounds similar to what these people are going to be having behind closed doors once the conference tournaments wrap up and they have to pick this thing. I mean, I think we're giving a little sneak peek into these kind of behind the scenes discussions that they're going to be having. And certainly once that field is selected, then it'll get picked apart by everyone. And, it's not an easy task that those guys have. So,
well, I mean, this is on a different subject, but they're going to be announcing this. They're going to announce the field and everybody's going to go, okay, well, what now? Are we playing it like, Indiana Lamar High School or something, or where the heck are we even going to play these games?
Yeah. Well, that
was a real subtle joke, by the way. Lamar was the father of education in Texas. And so to say Indiana Lamar, because there's a lot of Lamar high schools in Texas, right? So gotcha. Indiana Lamar, anyway.
Well, I would push for Hinkle Fieldhouse.
Is that's where the Hoosiers game was played?
Yeah.
Yeah, baby.
That would be cool.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Hickory. All right, we're gonna end it there. So
probably should have ended about 3 minutes ago before I started explaining my subtle joke. But...
Thanks, guys.
See ya.